July 30th, 1945. 12:14 a.m., Philippine Sea, 600 miles west of Guam. The first torpedo struck with a force that felt like God himself had punched a hole through the ship. Seaman Second Class Lowell Dean Cox was asleep in his bunk when the explosion catapulted him 6 feet into the air. Before he could process what was happening, a second torpedo hit. The bow of the USS Indianapolis erupted in a column of fire that shot 150 feet into the night sky, illuminating the faces of 1,196 terrified sailors. In exactly 12 minutes, one of the proudest warships in the United States Navy would disappear beneath the waves. And for the men who survived that sinking, their nightmare was only beginning. What followed would become the deadliest shark attack in recorded human history. Nearly 900 men went into the water that night. Only 316 would come out alive. And the man who would be blamed for this catastrophe, Captain Charles Butler McVeigh III, had made one simple decision that seemed reasonable at the time. He had stopped zigzagging to save fuel. If you find this story as incredible as I do, take a second to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Trust me, what comes next will stay with you long after this video ends. To understand how a single tactical decision could lead to such devastation, we need to go back 11 days. July 19th, 1945. Mare Island Naval Shipyard, San Francisco Bay. Captain Charles McVeigh stood on the bridge of the Indianapolis, watching a peculiar operation unfold on his deck. 2 Army officers supervised the loading of a large wooden crate and a 15-foot canister. They were bolted to the deck of his ship with more care than McVeigh had ever seen applied to any cargo. Armed Marines took positions around both objects with orders to shoot anyone who approached without authorization. McVeigh was a decorated naval officer from a distinguished military family. His father had been an admiral. He had commanded the Indianapolis through some of the most brutal battles of the Pacific War. But when he asked what he was carrying, the Army officer's response chilled him. "Captain, if this ship sinks, the contents of that canister must be saved above all else, above the ship, above the crew, above you." What McVeigh didn't know, what almost no one on Earth knew at that moment, was that he was carrying the enriched uranium core for Little Boy, the atomic bomb that would destroy Hiroshima in just 18 days. The Indianapolis was chosen for this mission because she was the fastest ship available. A Portland-class heavy cruiser, she displaced 9,800 tons and could make 32 knots at flank speed. She had served as the flagship of the Fifth Fleet. She had survived kamikaze attacks that killed 9 of her crew. She was, by any measure, a warship of distinction. But there was something else about the Indianapolis that made her uniquely vulnerable for this mission, something that would prove fatal. She had no sonar equipment to detect submarines. And the reason for this vulnerability was almost absurd in its simplicity. The Indianapolis had been scheduled for a sonar refit at the Mare Island Naval Shipyard. She had been damaged by a kamikaze attack on March 31st, 1945, during the invasion of Okinawa. The suicide plane had crashed through her main deck, killing 9 sailors and blowing 2 massive holes in her hull. For 4 months, the Indianapolis sat in dry dock while workers repaired the damage. They patched the holes, replaced damaged equipment, and restored the ship to fighting condition. But when the call came for the secret mission, the Indianapolis was rushed out of the shipyard before her sonar upgrade could be completed. It was one of those small decisions that cascade into disaster. The ship was ready, but not complete, seaworthy, but not safe. And now she was heading into submarine-infested waters with no way to detect the enemy lurking beneath the surface. The orders McVeigh received were classified at the highest level. He was to proceed from San Francisco to the island of Tinian in the Mariana Islands at maximum speed. No stops, no delays, no radio communication unless absolutely necessary. The fate of the war itself might depend on his cargo arriving safely. At 8:00 a.m. on July 19th, the Indianapolis slipped her moorings and headed for the Golden Gate Bridge. Standing on the quarterdeck, 19-year-old Marine Private Giles McCoy watched San Francisco recede into the morning fog. He had no idea that he was beginning a journey that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The crossing to Pearl Harbor took just over 3 days. The Indianapolis arrived on July the 22nd, refueled in record time, and departed within hours. She didn't even drop anchor. From Pearl Harbor, McVeigh pushed his ship across 2,091 miles of open ocean in just 74.5 hours, an average speed of 28 knots. It was, at the time, the fastest crossing of the Pacific ever accomplished by a warship. On July 26, 1945, the Indianapolis arrived at Tinian. The mysterious cargo was offloaded with the same secrecy with which it had been loaded. Within hours, the components that would soon vaporize 80,000 human beings were in the hands of the Manhattan Project scientists waiting on the island. McVeigh's orders now changed. He was to proceed to the island of Leyte in the Philippines, where the Indianapolis would join Task Force 95 for gunnery training. From there, she would participate in the planned invasion of Japan. But that invasion would never happen, and neither would McVeigh's arrival at Leyte. At 9:00 a.m. on July 28th, the Indianapolis departed Guam for the final leg of her journey. Her route would take her 3,800 miles across the Philippine Sea to Leyte Gulf. McVeigh expected an uneventful voyage. The war was winding down. American air power dominated the skies. The Japanese surface fleet had been effectively destroyed. But what neither McVeigh nor anyone else in the American command fully appreciated was that Japanese submarines remained a deadly threat, and one of them was already hunting in the waters the Indianapolis would soon enter. The I-58 was a Type B-3 submarine commanded by Lieutenant Commander Mochitsura Hashimoto. At 356 feet long and displacing 2,584 tons, she was one of Japan's most formidable undersea weapons. Unlike most Japanese submarines, the I-58 was equipped with chitin, human-guided torpedoes piloted by young men who had volunteered to die for their emperor. But Hashimoto was a conventional submariner at heart. He had 6 chitin and 6 standard Type 95 torpedoes. If given the choice, he preferred to use conventional weapons. A torpedo could be aimed and fired multiple times. A chitin meant losing a man and a weapon, whether the attack succeeded or not. On the evening of July 29th, Hashimoto was patrolling at periscope depth, scanning the moonlit ocean for targets. The Japanese submarine war was going badly. American destroyers and aircraft made operations increasingly dangerous. Hashimoto had been at sea for weeks, without a single kill. His orders were to patrol the Philippine Sea and intercept American shipping. But American air and naval superiority had made this mission almost suicidal. Japanese submarines were being hunted relentlessly. Many of Hashimoto's fellow captains had already been killed. Hashimoto was a thoughtful man, a professional naval officer who did his duty without enthusiasm for the war itself. He had joined the Imperial Japanese Navy in 1931 and had spent his career studying the art of submarine warfare. He was skilled, patient, and careful. He knew that survival required discipline. On this patrol, he had encountered nothing but frustration. American destroyers had forced him to dive repeatedly. Aircraft had dropped depth charges that shook his vessel but failed to destroy it. He was running low on fuel and considering returning to base. But that was about to change. At approximately 11 p.m., Hashimoto's lookout spotted something on the horizon. A dark shape, moving fast. As the I-58 maneuvered for a better look, Hashimoto could scarcely believe what he was seeing. An American warship, unescorted, traveling in a straight line, not zigzagging. In the control room of the Indianapolis, Captain McVeigh had made a decision that would define the rest of his life and end the lives of nearly 900 men. Zigzagging was a defensive maneuver designed to make it harder for submarines to calculate a torpedo firing solution. By constantly changing course at irregular intervals, a ship became a moving target rather than a sitting duck. The technique was standard procedure for warships operating in submarine-infested waters. But zigzagging came with costs. It reduced speed, increased fuel consumption, and put additional strain on engines and crew. McVeigh had been given discretionary orders regarding zigzagging, the official language stating he should zigzag at his discretion, weather permitting. On the night of July 29th, McVeigh weighed his options. The moon was periodically obscured by clouds. Visibility was intermittent. His ship had been running hard for days, and his fuel reserves were a concern. Intelligence reports suggested the route was safe. No submarines had been reported in the area. At approximately 10:30 p.m., McVeigh gave the order to cease zigzagging. The Indianapolis settled onto a straight course of 262 degrees, heading west toward Leyte at 17 knots. 1,500 yards away, Commander Hashimoto was already calculating his attack. What McVeigh couldn't know was that the intelligence he had been given was dangerously incomplete. Just 5 days earlier, the destroyer escort USS Underhill had been sunk by a chitin attack in nearby waters. The Japanese submarine threat in the Philippine Sea was very real. But the message warning ships about increased submarine activity had never reached the Indianapolis. A communications failure, one of dozens that would plague this tragedy, had left McVeigh sailing blind into danger. At 12:02 a.m. on July 30th, Hashimoto gave the order to fire. 6 Type 95 torpedoes leaped from the tubes of the I-58, spreading out in a fan pattern toward the unsuspecting cruiser. The Type 95 torpedo was a devastating weapon. Powered by pure oxygen rather than compressed air, it left almost no visible wake. Each torpedo carried 1,210 pounds of high explosive and could travel at 49 knots for nearly 4 miles. The Indianapolis never saw them coming. The first torpedo struck the starboard bow at 12:14 a.m., detonating just below the waterline. The explosion was catastrophic. It tore off 40 feet of the ship's bow, destroying the forward fire rooms and killing hundreds of sleeping sailors instantly. 12 seconds later, the second torpedo hit amidships, directly beneath the bridge. This explosion was even more devastating. It ignited the forward fuel tanks and ammunition magazines. A fireball engulfed the ship's superstructure, incinerating men where they stood. In the forward compartments, water rushed in at a rate that defied imagination. Chief Boatswain's Mate Eugene Morgan was thrown from his bunk by the first explosion. By the time he reached the ladder to the upper deck, the compartment was already flooding. He climbed through total darkness, feeling the bodies of dead shipmates floating past him in the rising water. On the bridge, Captain McVeigh was knocked off his feet by the second explosion. When he stood, he found himself surrounded by fire. His executive officer, Commander Joseph Flynn, had been thrown across the bridge and was bleeding heavily from a head wound. McVeigh tried to assess the damage, but communication systems were down. The ship had no power. Emergency lighting flickered and died. In the chaos, officers shouted conflicting reports. Some said the ship had been bombed. Others thought they had hit a mine. Within seconds, McVeigh understood the truth. His ship was dying. The Indianapolis began to list heavily to starboard. Men on the lower decks fought desperately to reach topside, climbing through darkness, fire, and flooding compartments. Those who made it to the open deck found scenes of horror. The forward section of the ship was a mass of flames. Sailors with their clothes on fire jumped into the sea. Others, trapped below deck, screamed for help that would never come. The ship's whistle, powered by the last gasp of steam pressure, began shrieking uncontrollably, adding to the chaos. Marine Private Giles McCoy had been on watch topside when the torpedoes hit. The explosion threw him against a bulkhead, stunning him briefly. When he recovered, he found the deck tilting beneath his feet at an impossible angle. Oil was everywhere, making the surface treacherous. Men slipped and fell, sliding toward the rising water. McCoy began helping wounded sailors toward the high side of the ship. He found one man with no legs, still conscious, trying to crawl toward the rail. McCoy carried him to a life raft, but knew the man would not survive. Captain McVeigh made his way to the communications center, hoping to send a distress signal. What he found was a scene of total destruction. The radio room had taken a direct hit from the second torpedo. Equipment was smashed. Operators were dead at their stations. But unknown to McVeigh, one radio operator had managed to tap out a distress message in the seconds before the transmitter failed. Radio man Robert Stout, already wounded from the explosion, had sent 3 SOS signals with the ship's position before the equipment went dead. 3 messages that should have brought rescue within hours. 3 messages that incredibly would be ignored. At 12:27 a.m., just 12 minutes after the first torpedo hit, the Indianapolis rolled over and plunged beneath the waves. She went down bow first, her stern rising briefly against the stars before disappearing into the darkness. Approximately 900 men made it off the ship alive. They floated in the warm Philippine Sea, scattered across several square miles of ocean, clinging to life rafts, debris, and each other. They had no food, limited water, few life rafts, and no idea that rescue was days away. The Philippine Sea at night is a place of profound darkness. There are no city lights to reflect off the clouds, no distant shore to break the horizon. The survivors floated in a void, surrounded by the sounds of the ocean, the groans of their wounded shipmates, and the distant cries of men they could not see. The water temperature was around 85 degrees Fahrenheit, warm enough to prevent immediate hypothermia, but not warm enough to provide comfort. The men shivered nonetheless, their bodies responding to shock and fear rather than cold. Some men prayed. Others cursed. Many simply floated in stunned silence, trying to process what had just happened. 12 minutes ago, they had been asleep in their bunks, safe aboard one of the mightiest warships in the Pacific Fleet. Now they were adrift in the middle of nowhere, with nothing between them and the ocean floor but 3 miles of black water. The men in the water that first night faced immediate challenges. Oil from the ship's ruptured fuel tanks covered everything. It coated their skin, filled their mouths, burned their eyes. Many swallowed fuel oil in the chaos of abandoning ship, leading to violent vomiting that would leave them dangerously dehydrated. The survivors organized themselves as best they could. The largest group, approximately 400 men, gathered around a cluster of life rafts and floating debris. Smaller groups of 20 to 50 men drifted separately, unable to find the main body in the darkness. Captain McVeigh was among a small group of about 30 survivors who had found a single life raft. Despite being the commanding officer, McVeigh had no way to coordinate the scattered groups. Visibility was limited, and voices carried only short distances across the swells. As dawn broke on July 30th, the survivors got their first clear look at their situation, and it was worse than any of them had imagined. The ocean stretched empty in every direction. No ships, no aircraft, no sign that anyone knew they were there. They were 600 miles from the nearest land, floating in water 12,000 feet deep. But the emptiness was an illusion. They were not alone in that water, not alone at all. The first shark appeared around midday. Dr. Lewis Haynes was the ship's senior medical officer and one of the few officers who made it off alive. He had organized the largest group of survivors, keeping them together through a combination of leadership and sheer force of will. When he saw the first dorsal fin cutting through the swells, his blood ran cold. It was an oceanic whitetip, and it was not alone. The oceanic whitetip is one of the most dangerous sharks in the world. Growing up to 10 feet long, these apex predators are known for their aggressive behavior and their tendency to investigate anything floating at the surface. In 1945, sailors called them by another name. They called them the murderers. What made the oceanic whitetip particularly terrifying was its persistence. Unlike other sharks that might investigate and leave, whitetips would circle for hours, days even, waiting for an opportunity. They were scavengers by nature, evolved to follow ships across the ocean in hopes of feeding on garbage thrown overboard. But they were also opportunistic hunters. The Indianapolis survivors had inadvertently created the perfect feeding ground. Hundreds of men, many of them wounded and bleeding, scattered across miles of open water. The blood in the water acted like a dinner bell, drawing sharks from miles around. Within hours of the sinking, marine biologists estimate that dozens, possibly hundreds, of sharks had gathered in the area. The survivors were surrounded by a population of predators that outnumbered them and outmatched them in every way. The first attacks began in the late afternoon of July the 30th. Stragglers, men who had drifted away from the main groups, were the first to disappear. One moment they were there, treading water alone. The next they were simply gone, pulled beneath the surface with barely a splash. The sharks were learning, testing, figuring out that these floating objects were food. By nightfall, the attacks intensified. The darkness brought terror. Men could not see the sharks coming, but could feel them bumping against their legs, investigating. A scream would pierce the night, followed by thrashing, then silence, then another scream from somewhere else. Marine Private Giles McCoy discovered something that would save his life. Sharks seemed to prefer isolated prey. Men who grouped tightly together were attacked less frequently than those who drifted alone. McCoy spent the night kicking, splashing, and fighting to keep his group close. But the psychological toll was devastating. Sleep was impossible. Every ripple in the water, every brush against a leg, sent panic through the survivors. Men began to hallucinate from exhaustion, dehydration, and sheer terror. By the morning of July 31st, the first signs of delirium appeared. Seaman Second Class. Harlan Twyble watched a friend from his division suddenly announce that the ship was just below the surface and that he was going down to get fresh water from the scuttlebutt. Before anyone could stop him, the man duck-dived beneath the surface and never came back. The hallucinations spread like a contagion. Men claimed to see the Indianapolis floating intact just beneath them. Others insisted there was an island nearby with fresh water. Groups of delirious sailors would swim off together toward imaginary destinations, leaving the relative safety of the larger groups. The hallucinations were not random. They reflected the deepest desires and fears of men pushed past the point of rational thought. Some saw rescue ships that weren't there. Others saw Japanese submarines surfacing to take prisoners. A few claimed to see loved ones, mothers and wives who beckoned them to swim just a little farther. Radio man Jack Miner later described the experience of watching his best friend lose his mind. He started talking about his mother's cooking, said he could smell bacon frying. Then he just let go of the raft and started swimming toward the smell. We tried to stop him, but he fought us off. Said we were trying to keep him from breakfast. We never saw him again. The cruelest hallucinations involved water. Men would swear they had found a fresh water supply just below the surface. They would dive down to drink, swallowing lungfuls of salt water before they realized their mistake. The more they drank, the thirstier they became. The cycle would repeat until their bodies simply gave out. Saltwater poisoning was claiming victims now. Men who drank seawater suffered rapid physical and mental deterioration. Their bodies, already dehydrated, processed the salt by pulling water from their tissues. Kidneys began to fail, brain function deteriorated. Within hours of drinking seawater, men would become violent and delusional before slipping into comas. Dr. Haynes did everything he could. He moved through the groups of survivors, checking on the wounded, encouraging the healthy, trying desperately to keep men from drinking seawater. He had no medicine, no supplies, no tools, except his voice and his presence. What Dr. Haynes accomplished in those 5 days bordered on the impossible. He performed field surgery with nothing but his bare hands. He set broken bones using pieces of debris as splints. He talked men through moments of panic that could have killed them. Most importantly, Dr. Haynes maintained a presence of calm in the midst of chaos. When men began to lose hope, he reminded them that rescue was coming. When they grew violent from delirium, he subdued them with gentle words and firm hands. When they wanted to give up, he refused to let them. Years later, survivors would credit Dr. Haynes with saving their lives, not through medicine, but through sheer force of will. He was our anchor, one survivor recalled. As long as the doctor was there, as long as he kept moving among us, we knew we weren't completely lost. But even Dr. Haynes could not stop what was coming. On the second day, the sharks became bolder. They no longer waited for isolated prey. They began attacking the edges of the survivor groups, pulling men from the periphery. The water would churn red for a moment, then go still. Then the sharks would circle and return. The men developed a grim routine. They would gather in tight clusters, facing outward, kicking at any shark that approached. When an attack came, those nearby would beat at the water, trying to drive the sharks away. Sometimes it worked, often it didn't. Chief Gunner's mate, Cecil Harrison, organized the men in his group into a defensive formation. They linked arms, creating a human ring, with the wounded placed in the center. But the sharks learned to approach from below, striking upward where the men couldn't see or defend. By nightfall on July 31st, the death toll was mounting rapidly. Between shark attacks, dehydration, and saltwater poisoning, men were dying at a rate of several per hour. Bodies had to be released into the sea because the living lacked the strength to hold them. Dr. Haynes made a terrible decision. He began removing life jackets from the dead and giving them to the living. It was necessary for survival, but it meant pushing friends, shipmates, brothers into the depths. Where are the rescuers? That was the question that haunted every surviving man. Why wasn't anyone coming? Surely someone knew they were missing. The answer to that question would prove to be one of the most damning administrative failures in the history of the United States Navy. When the Indianapolis failed to arrive at Lady Gulf as scheduled on July 31st, no one reported her missing. This was not an oversight, it was the result of a deliberate policy. In 1945, the Navy had established a system called non-reporting for combatant vessels. The idea was that important ships like cruisers should not announce their arrivals because such messages could be intercepted by the enemy. Instead, the port of arrival was supposed to note when a ship came in. But this system had a fatal flaw. If a ship didn't arrive, no one was required to investigate. The assumption was that the ship had been diverted to another port or had received orders that weren't widely distributed. When the Indianapolis didn't arrive at Lady on July 31st, the port commander assumed she had been sent elsewhere. No alarm was raised, no search was initiated. Meanwhile, the 3 SOS messages that radioman Robert Stout had sent before the ship went down had reached American installations. 3 separate naval stations received the distress call. And in one of the most inexplicable failures of the war, all 3 were dismissed. The first station's commander was drunk. He ordered his men not to disturb him. The second station's officer assumed it was a Japanese trap, a false message meant to lure American ships into an ambush. The third station received the message, but took no action because they couldn't confirm its authenticity. 3 chances to save nearly 900 men. 3 chances thrown away through negligence, suspicion, and incompetence. Back in the water, the survivors had no way of knowing that their distress calls had been ignored. They clung to hope, scanning the sky for aircraft, the horizon for ships. Surely someone was coming. Surely someone knew. August 1st dawned with no rescue in sight. The survivors had now been in the water for nearly 48 hours. Dehydration was becoming critical. Men who had been strong and healthy when they went into the water were now barely conscious, their lips cracked, their tongues swollen. The shark attacks continued without pause. The predators had lost all fear of the humans. They attacked at will, sometimes pulling men under in front of their friends, sometimes merely biting and moving on, leaving the victim to die slowly from blood loss. Marine Private McCoy witnessed scenes that would give him nightmares for the rest of his life. He saw a shark bite a man completely in half. He watched friends disappear beneath the surface, their hands the last thing visible before they vanished. He saw men go mad from thirst and terror, screaming, fighting, sometimes killing each other in their delirium. Captain McVeigh's small group was faring slightly better. They had a life raft, which kept them out of the water and provided some protection from sharks. But McVeigh was tormented by guilt and confusion. He had followed orders. He had made decisions that seemed reasonable at the time. How had it come to this? On the third day, August 2nd, hope was fading. Men stopped fighting for their lives and simply slipped beneath the waves. Others became violent, attacking their shipmates in fits of delirium. The groups that had numbered in the hundreds were now down to dozens. Dr. Haynes, who had worked tirelessly to save lives, found himself performing a grim triage. He could no longer help everyone. He focused on those with the best chance of survival, quietly moving away from those who were clearly dying. It was the hardest thing he had ever done. And then, at approximately 11 a.m. on August the 2nd, a miracle happened. Lieutenant Wilbur Gwynn was piloting a Lockheed PV-1 Ventura bomber on a routine anti-submarine patrol. His aircraft was experiencing antenna problems, and he dropped altitude to have his radio man check the trailing wire. As he descended, Gwynn happened to glance out the window. What he saw made him think he was hallucinating. Below him, scattered across miles of ocean, were dark spots. Dozens of them, hundreds of them. He dropped lower, and the dark spots resolved into human heads. Gwyn immediately radioed his base. Many men in the water. His message set in motion the largest sea rescue operation of World War II. But rescue would not be immediate, and not everyone would be saved. The first ships to respond were still hours away. Gwyn circled overhead, dropping everything his aircraft carried that might help: life rafts, dye markers, emergency supplies. His presence gave the survivors something they had almost lost: hope. At 3:37 p.m., a PBY Catalina flying boat piloted by Lieutenant Adrian Marks arrived on scene. Marks took one look at the survivors in the water and made a decision that violated every rule of naval aviation. He landed his seaplane in the open ocean. A PBY Catalina was never designed to land in open water swells. The risk of structural failure was enormous, but Marks had seen the shark attacks happening in real time. Men were dying every minute he delayed. Rules be damned. Marks brought his aircraft down in a controlled crash landing that buckled the hull but kept the plane afloat. For the next several hours, he taxied through the debris field, pulling survivors onto the wings of his damaged aircraft. When the fuselage was full, he strapped men to the wings with parachute cord. The scene inside and around the aircraft was chaotic and desperate. Survivors who had spent days praying for rescue now clung to the wings with the last of their strength. Some were so delirious they didn't understand they had been saved. Others wept uncontrollably, unable to believe their ordeal was ending. Marks and his crew worked tirelessly, pulling men from the water, administering first aid, and trying to keep the damaged aircraft stable. They had no medical supplies except basic first aid kits. They had no food or water to spare, but they had their hands, their strength, and their determination to save as many lives as possible. One survivor, Seaman First Class Raymond Hopper, later described the moment he was pulled onto the aircraft. "I thought I was dreaming. I'd been dreaming about rescue for days, and every time I woke up I was still in the water. When they grabbed my arm, I thought the sharks had finally gotten me. It took me hours to believe I was actually safe." By nightfall, Marks had rescued 56 survivors. His aircraft, damaged beyond repair, served as a floating refuge until the rescue ships arrived. The destroyer USS Cecil Doyle was the first ship on scene, arriving just before midnight. Her captain, Graham Claytor, made the unprecedented decision to turn on his searchlights, making his ship a beacon for the scattered survivors, but also a potential target for any Japanese submarines in the area. Claytor didn't care about the risk. He could see men dying in the water. He would not let them die in the darkness. Throughout the night of August 2nd and into the morning of August 3rd, ships arrived and began the painstaking process of retrieving survivors. Men who had been in the water for nearly 4 days were pulled from the sea, many of them unresponsive, all of them bearing the scars of their ordeal. The rescue operation continued for 3 days. Ships crisscrossed the debris field looking for any survivors who might have drifted away. Bodies were recovered when possible. Personal effects were collected to help identify the dead. When the final count was completed, the numbers were staggering. Of the 1,196 men aboard the Indianapolis when she was torpedoed, approximately 900 survived the sinking. Of those 900 men, only 316 were pulled alive from the water. Nearly 580 men died during the 5 days between the sinking and the rescue. It was the greatest loss of life at sea in the history of the United States Navy. The survivors were taken to hospitals throughout the Pacific. Many would spend months recovering from their injuries. Some would never fully recover. The psychological trauma of what they had experienced would stay with them forever. Marine Private Giles McCoy weighed 83 pounds when he was pulled from the water. He had weighed 175 pounds when the Indianapolis sailed from San Francisco. He would spend years trying to understand what he had lived through. Dr. Lewis Haynes was credited with saving dozens of lives through his leadership and medical skills. He rarely spoke of what he had witnessed. The memories were too painful to share. But for Captain Charles McVeigh, the nightmare was far from over. In November 1945, Captain McVeigh was court-martialed. He was charged with failing to order abandon ship in a timely manner and with hazarding his vessel by failing to zigzag. It was the only court-martial of a naval captain for the loss of his ship due to enemy action in the entire history of the United States Navy. The trial was controversial from the start. The Navy brought in Commander Mochitsura Hashimoto, the man who had sunk the Indianapolis, to testify. It was an unprecedented move, having an enemy commander testify against an American officer. The courtroom fell silent when Hashimoto entered. Here was the man who had fired the torpedoes, standing just feet away from the captain he had nearly killed. The survivors who had gathered to support McVeigh watched the Japanese commander with a mixture of anger, curiosity, and something approaching respect. Hashimoto's testimony actually helped McVeigh. The Japanese commander stated clearly that the Indianapolis would have been sunk whether she was zigzagging or not. The ship had been lit by the moon, traveling at a moderate speed, completely unaware of the submarine's presence. No amount of zigzagging would have saved her. "I would have sunk that ship regardless of any evasive maneuvers," Hashimoto testified through a translator. "The conditions were perfect for an attack. The ship was silhouetted against the horizon. I had a clear firing solution. Nothing Captain McVeigh could have done would have prevented the torpedoes from striking." It was remarkable testimony. An enemy commander speaking in defense of the man the Navy wanted to convict. Several observers noted the irony. The only person in the courtroom who truly understood what had happened that night was the man who had caused it. But the court found McVeigh guilty of hazarding his ship. He was sentenced to lose 100 numbers in his temporary rank. The sentence was later remitted by the Secretary of the Navy, but the conviction stood. For the survivors of the Indianapolis, the verdict was a betrayal. They knew that McVeigh had followed orders. They knew that the failure of the Navy to report their ship missing had cost hundreds of lives. They knew that the real responsibility lay with the system, not with their captain. But McVeigh bore the burden alone. He received hate mail from the families of dead sailors. He was blamed by parents who had lost their sons. He never defended himself publicly, never spoke against the Navy that had abandoned him. Charles McVeigh retired from the Navy in 1949. For the next 19 years, he lived quietly, haunted by the deaths of his men and the conviction that would never leave his record. On November 6, 1968, Charles Butler McVeigh III walked onto his front porch in Litchfield, Connecticut. In his hand was his Navy service revolver. In his pocket was a small toy sailor that had been sent to him by a survivor, a talisman he had carried since the sinking. He put the gun to his head and pulled the trigger. Captain Charles Butler McVeigh III died on his own terms, but he did not die forgotten. The survivors of the Indianapolis carried his memory with them, and they refused to let the Navy's injustice stand. The campaign to exonerate McVeigh began almost immediately after his death. But it took decades to gain momentum. The survivors were scattered across the country, many struggling with their own trauma, unable to organize effectively. The Navy resisted any attempt to reopen the case. The breakthrough came in 1996, when a 12-year-old Florida boy named Hunter Scott began researching the Indianapolis for a school history project. Scott interviewed dozens of survivors and discovered the full extent of the Navy's failures. He wrote to members of Congress, presented his findings at public hearings, and became an unexpected advocate for a captain who had died before he was born. Hunter Scott's campaign captured national attention. Here was a child, armed with nothing but determination and the truth, taking on the United States Navy. His efforts inspired others to join the cause. The survivors of the Indianapolis spent decades fighting to clear their captain's name. They wrote letters. They testified before Congress. They refused to let his story be forgotten. In October 2000, 55 years after the sinking, President Bill Clinton signed legislation exonerating Captain McVeigh. The resolution stated that his record should reflect that he was exonerated for the loss of the Indianapolis, and that the American people should now recognize his courageous service to his country. For the survivors, it was a bittersweet victory. McVeigh was not alive to see his name cleared. Neither were most of the men who had fought so hard to save him. But the story of the Indianapolis had finally been told truthfully. A captain who had been made a scapegoat was finally given justice, and the men who had suffered through the greatest maritime disaster in American naval history were finally honored for their sacrifice. Today, survivors of the Indianapolis meet annually to remember their shipmates. Their numbers dwindle each year. The youngest survivors are now in their 90s. Soon, there will be no one left who can speak firsthand of those terrible days in the Philippine Sea. But the story endures. It is taught in military academies as a case study in communication failures. It is studied by historians as an example of institutional negligence. It is remembered by the families of the 879 men who died, passed down through generations as a sacred trust. And it stands as a reminder of how quickly courage can turn to tragedy, how easily decisions made with the best intentions can lead to catastrophe, and how the actions of a few individuals, for better or worse, can determine the fates of hundreds. The USS Indianapolis was more than a ship. She was a community of 196 young Americans who went to sea in the service of their country. She carried the weapon that would end the deadliest war in human history, and she suffered a fate that no vessel and no crew should ever have to endure. Commander Mochitsura Hashimoto survived the war. He became a Shinto priest in Japan, dedicating his life to spiritual service. In 1999, he wrote a letter supporting the movement to exonerate Captain McVeigh. "I came forward to give testimony at his court-martial," Hashimoto wrote, "and I now come forward again to see that his name is cleared." It was, perhaps, the final act of a tragedy that had brought together two enemies in an unlikely alliance. The man who fired the torpedoes and the man who was blamed for not avoiding them, united in death by their shared humanity. The waters of the Philippine Sea are quiet now. The wreck of the Indianapolis lies on the ocean floor 18,000 feet beneath the surface, a grave marker for the hundreds who never came home. For 62 years after the sinking, no one knew exactly where she rested. In August 2017, a research team led by Microsoft co-founder Paul Allen located the wreck. Using advanced sonar technology, they found the Indianapolis sitting upright on the seafloor, her hull largely intact despite the violence of her sinking. The discovery was the culmination of years of research and detective work. Historians had long debated the exact location of the sinking. Different survivors had given different coordinates, and the chaos of that night made precise navigation impossible. Allen's team used newly declassified Navy records to narrow down the search area. They discovered a ship's log from another vessel that had recorded the Indianapolis passing by on her final voyage. By tracing the ship's course from that point, they calculated a more accurate search area. The moment the Indianapolis appeared on the sonar screens, the research team fell silent. There she was, the ghost ship that had haunted American naval history for over 7 decades. Her turrets were still in place. Her hull number was still visible. She looked almost peaceful, as if she were simply resting on the ocean floor. When the images were released, survivors wept. The ship that had been their home, their pride, their nightmare, was finally visible again. Some said it brought them closure. Others said it reopened wounds that had never fully healed. But all agreed on one thing. The Indianapolis deserved to be remembered. Her crew deserved to be honored. And the story of what happened to them, from the torpedoes to the sharks to the failure of rescue, deserved to be told to every generation that follows. This is that story. It is a story of heroism and horror, of courage and catastrophe, of men pushed beyond the limits of human endurance who found ways to survive, and of those who did not. It is the story of a captain who made a reasonable decision and paid for it with his life. It is the story of a navy that failed its own men and then blamed its captain for its failures. It is the story of survivors who refused to let the truth be buried along with their shipmates. And it is the story of 879 American sailors who went to sleep one July night in 1945 and never woke up, their lives cut short by torpedoes, sharks, dehydration, and a system that forgot they existed. They deserve to be remembered, all of them. The dead and the living, the captain and his crew, the men who fought the sharks, and the men who succumbed to them, the rescuers who risked everything, and the administrators who risked nothing. Captain Charles McVeigh stopped zigzagging to save fuel. It was a reasonable decision based on the information he had. He could not have known that a Japanese submarine was watching. He could not have known that his distress calls would be ignored. He could not have known that his ship would not be reported missing for 5 days. He made a choice, and then he lived with the consequences of that choice for the rest of his life, which was cut short by his own hand because he could no longer bear the weight of blame that was never truly his to carry. The lesson of the Indianapolis is not that one man made a mistake. The lesson is that systems fail. Communication breaks down, assumptions go unchallenged, and when those failures combine, the result can be catastrophic. Nearly 900 men went into the water on July 30th, 1945. Only 316 came out alive. The rest are still out there, somewhere in the depths of the Philippine Sea, forever young, forever frozen, in that moment when the torpedoes struck and the world changed forever. They were fathers and sons, brothers and friends. They were teenagers on their first deployment and veterans of a dozen battles. They were engineers and gunners, radio men and Marines. They were the crew of the USS Indianapolis. And they should never, ever be forgotten. On this day, remember them. Remember Captain McVeigh, who bore blame he did not deserve. Remember Dr. Haynes, who saved lives he could not save. Remember Private McCoy, who survived nightmares no man should have to face. Remember the sharks that circled in the darkness. Remember the sun that burned without mercy. Remember the water that promised relief but brought only death. Remember the Indianapolis. She was lost, but she is not gone. Her story lives on, told and retold, a warning and a memorial, a tragedy and a testament to the endurance of the human spirit. And as long as that story is told, the men of the Indianapolis will never truly die. They sail on, in memory, in honor, in the hearts of all who hear their tale. Fair winds and following seas, Indianapolis. Your voyage is finally over. Your crew is finally home. The sharks cannot touch them now. The water cannot claim them again. They rest in peace, their duty done, their sacrifice remembered, their names written in the stars that watched over them during those terrible nights in the Philippine Sea. And somewhere, perhaps, Captain Charles Butler McVeigh III stands on a bridge that never sinks, watching over his men, finally free of the burden that destroyed him, finally at peace with the choice that was never really his to make. The war is over, the blame is lifted, the truth is known. And the Indianapolis, at last, has come home. Remember them. They were the best of us. They still are.